Hey, what's up, guys? Casino Crime, video number 5. Back again, and stoked, man. I'm ready to talk some poker today. Uh, before we hop right into the lesson, as always, what I do is give you a book recommendation or a quote that'll help you both, well, hopefully on the tables, but more specifically away from the tables to, achieve success in all areas of life, whether you're a professional player and doing this for a living or you're just trying to turn this into a profitable hobby, or hell, maybe you just like playing poker and you want to not suck and be able to battle or go to war with your friends. So, this week's book is one of my favorites. It's got kind of a cheesy title. It's called How to Get Rich, but it's by this guy, Felix Dennis. He's a very famous self made entrepreneur, extremely rich guy. He's passed away now, a couple of years ago, I believe, but he's an incredible writer. It's almost like reading poetry when you read this stuff, and he's got a lot of good advice for people who want to start businesses who do in fact want to get rich. I mean, he's like the ultimate capitalist, and some of the stuff he says is a little crude, but you can never really fault someone for being honest because it is difficult to do. And someone who's as honest as he is in this book deserves credit, and I would highly recommend it for you guys to read. There's a lot of good life philosophies in there, and I don't know. It's from my experience, it seems that a lot of poker players are entrepreneurs themselves. I mean, um, let's face it, poker's getting harder every day, and it takes a lot of grit. It takes a lot of hustle, a lot of dedication. There's a lot of similarities to starting a business when you're starting to play poker. So a lot of the stuff that I read that's not completely focused on, poker theory or improving my immediate poker game on the felt is business books, because I think that there's a lot of parallels between being successful in poker and being successful in business. There's a lot of reasons why, hedge fund guys and other successful businessmen love to play poker, because it's complements their skill set really well. So anyhow, check out this book. I think it's awesome. It's like $10 on Kindle, but it'll surely give you some good advice. So what we're going to talk today about is check raising fundamentals. Speaking of getting rich, right? Well, check raising is a big deal in PLO. We haven't really talked about it too much. Most of the stuff that we've covered has been on sort of like the fundamental theories of poker and kind of like how to build, or PLO I should say, how to build solid pre-flop theory, and like get to know what we're going after for allowing ourselves to even have check raising ranges in the first place. So what I'm going to do going forward, or at least for today's lesson, this is probably going to end up being 2 lessons. I personally believe that check raising is an extremely important quality for any PLO player, and the main reason is because in a game like Hold'em, for example, you don't check raise quite as much. Of course, there is check raising, but I think it's different. It's like it's a more polarized game. Check calling is a lot more common in No Limit, and you can kind of get away with check calling profitably more often in No Limit. But in PLO, you really need to be able to like check raise your ass off, and look for good spots look for good spots. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go through a few slides, and then we are going to go through a few hand histories. Hopefully you like it. And something I've found to be weird, and maybe one of somebody out there can help me find this out, is that at the entryway for most of the poker rooms in Vegas, they have a sign that says check raising is permitted in this poker room. What the hell's all that about? Was there seriously a time where players weren't allowed to check raise? They probably outlawed it because all of the nitty old men got bitter when tourists came into town and check raised them too much. Well, fortunately for us, we're allowed to check raise however much we want to in PLO, which is a good thing because when used properly, check raising makes you a lot tougher to play against. And similar to the floating strategy that most of you guys are familiar with, the main players to target are the ones who c-bet too much. Check raising against these players makes sense because when you pull the trigger and take down the pot, you pick up the dead money from their c-bet in the process. And another benefit of check raising is that assuming there's a c-bet on the flop, check raising allows you to get the money in much faster than if you only called. And remember how, we talked about, in other videos that the positional advantage decreases as the SPR gets smaller? Well, check raising and getting the money in quick prevents us from making a mistake on later streets and also gives us some fold equity along with our semi-bluff, which results in more long-term profit. Also, check raising buys you free cards in the future because the natural adjustment against players that are capable of check raising light is to start checking back more often. And this really works to our advantage because once they start checking back more flops, that means they're giving you the chance to realize your equity out of position. Which, if you remember again, from a video a couple of weeks ago, is one of the things you're not supposed to be able to do when we're out of position. We're going to talk about, check raising going forward a little more, but for now, realize that especially on later streets, it's very important that your opponents know that you're capable of check raising later streets for this exact reason. Now, the last thing I want to cover before we move on is that in regards to check raising, the number of opponents in the hand makes a big difference for both if and how often you check raise, in addition to what hands you choose to do it with. You get a better feel for what I'm talking about, after we go over the hand histories following the slides. But for now, just realize that the majority of your check raise bluffs will be in heads-up pots, because there's more good opportunities for it, since it's more likely that your opponents will c-bet, as well as the reduced chance they actually flop something good enough to continue against your check raise. And on the other hand, the majority of check raises in multi-way pots will be for the purpose of getting the money in fast with a strong hand, or because you have a big draw and are trying to maximize your fold equity. All right, so now that we know that why check raising is profitable and which opponent types to target, what kind of board textures should we be looking to pull the trigger on? Before we get any further, there's a couple of things that we need to establish. First one being that on this slide, we're only talking about check raise bluffing, not check raising when we actually have the stones. It's not that check raising with the stones is necessarily bad on these boards, but I want to save that part about check raising with equity for later on. For now, let's look at a few different board textures that are good candidates for check raise bluffing. Monotone boards are good for check raising because hands that aren't flushes are drawing practically dead, which translates into most players giving up pretty easily when they're faced with some aggression. Check raising with a set on monotone boards is also a good option because you have one of the few hands that actually has equity on a monotone board, which, accompanied with the fold equity from your check raise, could be a very profitable line to take. Now, something that's very important to note is that the dynamic on monotone boards changes dramatically as you develop history with someone. As we've talked about before, the play dynamic on static boards is very frequency driven. So once two players get to the level where they both know that the other probably doesn't have a flush, you'll be forced to get more creative if you're trying to make them fold by way of reverse floating and taking other lines. Like monotone boards, paired boards are good for check raise bluffing because besides trips, there aren't many hands that have enough equity to call you. And also, similar to monotone boards, the dynamic and therefore the lines you take on paired boards changes dramatically once you develop history with a player. Also, most players won't give you nearly as much credit when you check raise on a deuce-deuce-4 board compared to when you check raise on a jack-jack-8 board. So don't just fire at the hip for no reason. Or in other words, make sure your bluff actually makes sense. Alright, so we know that check raising paired and monotone boards works well, but what happens when players start to pick up on our strategy and adjust by rebluffing and calling us down lighter? Well, in my opinion, we should look for more boards that fit our requirements. Remember, we're looking for boards that players c-bet with a high frequency, but that don't flop equity on very often. High-low-low boards fit this requirement perfectly, and even though boards like this provide more equity to players than the textures we covered last slide, there's still a very wide range of hands that people will fold. Any pair below the top card is drawing poorly against top pair with side cards, and additionally, players won't just peel you with a wide range because of the threat of future bets. High-low-low boards are much different than high-high-low boards, because the latter contain straight draws that are more likely to be in the ranges of hands that people open with preflop. It's also important to point out that you're not limited to check raising only air on these boards. So for example, if you have a pair and a straight draw on any of these boards, both check raising and donk betting on these boards is a good line to take, depending on their c-betting tendencies. Other boards that are cash money to check raise are the lockdown boards, which, as explained by Phil Galfond, are boards where there are very few hands that have equity against the current nuts. Now, up to this point, we've covered the different opponents and board textures that meet the requirements for good check raising opportunities. But there's something else that you can use to increase the success rate of your check raises as well as your overall hand reading skills. What you should do is start paying attention to the PFRs of your opponents and how their opening ranges fit into each board texture. Let's use an easy example to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. Let's say a solid regular that's playing a 22-15 opens from under the gun. What do you think his under the gun opening range consists of? Mostly big single-suited and double-suited pairs, as well as the premium connected rundowns, right? Well, that means that it's probably not a good idea to check raise bluff the boards that have a lot of broadways. Now, up to this point, we've spent a lot of time talking about when you should be looking to check raise with air, but we don't always need air to check raise, do we? What about the times when we're out of position and flop a small piece, or have some backdoor equity that we want to realize? Should we check raise then? The short answer to all of those questions is yes, definitely. Especially when you have a blocker to the nuts on the board, or you have some backdoor draws to go along with a pair on the board. Check raising is a viable option. Because like we've said before, it's always better to bluff with equity than without equity. So for example, let's say we have King, Queen, Jack 10 single suited on a 10-4-5 rainbow board. Especially in heads-up pots, these are the types of boards that get c-bet almost always, but there's not too many hands that can continue against a check raise. Even overpairs are in tough spots facing a check raise because you're representing a set, a big draw, or two pair, which they're either flipping or slightly ahead of. And on the one hand, you're forcing them to make a mistake by folding away their equity on the flop, but on the other hand, calling your check raise puts them in many awkward turn spots because most people don't check raise and then check fold the turn very often. Put more simply, the threat of future bets is very powerful. Besides, even if we get called, any diamond, 10, 9, 8, ace, king, queen, or jack are cards that give us more equity and allow us to keep barreling away. The next example is similar, except this time we don't have a pair, and yet we still have a wide range of cards that we can continue to barrel. Again, the main point you want to focus on here is the fact that board textures like this get c-bet a high percentage of the time, but the continuing ranges of your opponents are pretty narrow facing a check raise. Just like the last hand, there's a variety of turn cards that we can continue to stay aggressive on. Any diamond, heart, deuce, ace, 8, jack, or 10 are good for us. Add this on top of our fold equity, and you have a very profitable check raise scenario. All right, so those were kind of the check raising fundamentals, but what we're going to talk about, especially in the hand histories, are situations where we can check raise lightly that are kind of unconventional. As the game evolves, I think it's important that we all pay attention to different board textures where people give you credit and different board textures where people play back at. And there's mainly, and again, we'll talk about this more in a moment, but there's mainly three things that I look for when I'm trying to execute a check raise. One is, of course, yes, the player type. I typically do not check raise unknowns light at all. My overall strategy in PLO and really poker is to arrive at the table and play tight for the first couple of orbits. There's nothing wrong with getting a read on the table and developing a tight image. One thing I will tell you for sure is that it's so difficult, no matter how skilled you are at poker, to play and be profitable with a bad image. It's just so hard. Once your image is bad, it takes a long time to get it back. So what I like to do, and this is some advice I got from a close friend who's been very successful. He said when he goes and plays live, he makes sure he does whatever he can to win the first hand, to show the first hand that he plays to show down a winner. And I've found that if I can show down a winner, especially in live games, if I can show down a winner on like my the first time that somebody actually is like seeing me play a hand, it's so good for your image. So I take image into account, both my image and what I think of my opponent, and then I take into account blockers, and we'll talk more about blockers here in a moment. And then I take into account, my pot equity. Those are really the main things. If we don't have any reads, we have no blockers and no pot equity, well, then don't check raise. If we have, a decent blocker and some kind of read on our opponent that he might be wide, well, then that's a decent spot to check raise. So if I have like 2 out of those 3 components, I usually go for a check raise. Okay, so here we've got a couple of different scenarios, and I've got several here, but I'm only going to bring up the first 2, and I'll save the last ones for the next video. But here we've got, the first one is when we hold blockers to value hands, or blockers to hands that can fight back when facing a check raise. And again, I would write this down because we're going to go over this in the hand histories, and it'll all make sense. And the second one is when we hold blockers to draws. And these are spots that I feel people don't talk about very much in other videos that I'd like to cover, and it'll make sense here in a moment. So let's get to the hand histories. All right, welcome back. So this is a good example of a hand where I felt that check raising would be a good option because we have blockers to the types of hands that our opponent can fight back against us. So don't have a lot of reads on this opponent, but he opens for 2.5x on the button. Seems tight so far, kind of regular stats. Maybe he's competent, who knows, but we call from the big blind. I think it's fine. Some players 3-bet this. I can find situations to 3-bet it, but when facing a 2.5x open And without any particular reads, I like to lean towards a call. As I said, until I get reads on players, I generally play pretty straightforward, and I'm not really looking to play big pots without knowing too much about a player, that's for sure. Folding here would be a mistake facing a 2.5x open, but here, we call on see a flop. Flops King Jack 5, two-tone, we check. He bets 440 into 580, and we've got a decision. So I've noticed that a lot of no limit players out there, they kind of see this flop in our hand and they say, well, we have a pair of jacks. That's what they say. And they have a difficult time understanding how this isn't really just like a pair of jacks in PLO. And, the line would be pretty much always in a hold'em that you would just check call here with your like queen jack, jack 10, jack 9 type hands, and which is fine. But, in PLO, the easiest way to lose money is to build up pots and big up on them and give up on them. And, the most difficult spot to play in PLO on top of that is to check call out of position with medium strength hands. So it's going to feel unnatural at first. But in a lot of cases like this one where, we decide to check raise, you are effectively turning your hand into a bluff, but it's basically preventing you from getting bluffed on later streets. And the thing that's nice here is that we got a couple of things going for us. First, we're fighting back against a button opening range, which is nice. One of the things that I advocate, and I talked about a lot in the slides, is when you are applying post-flop aggression, make sure to do it against wide pre-flop ranges. You won't run into strong hands as often. Most of the time you can say that this board is pretty heavy in people's ranges. Like, there's a lot of stuff that could be connected with this board, like ace queen 10 type hands, set type hands, aces with gutter and nut flush draw type hands. But those I've done the math on this, and those combinations are greatly reduced when you're facing something like a button opening range or really any opening range. Now, if this same player had opened under the gun, I would be more reluctant to check raise this hand, only because we would run into the nuts much more often. But not only is his pre-flop range wide, but we also have a jack blocker. So, does our jack have value? Yeah, on some level it certainly has value. If action were to stop right now, if there were to be no more betting, then I would prefer calling. I wouldn't check raise. But there's no guarantees on that. We don't know if he can barrel and bluff us. We're really unsure. So I would prefer to just check raise here, and kind of turn our hand into a bluff, and do so with. I know we might have some outs. I mean, the jack could be an out if he decides to call us with like king queen 10 or something. Maybe our two pair outs are clean. Who knows? So. It's nice having the blocker though, because it's a blocker basically to king jack, and to a set of jacks. Both of which are hands that would be able to like rejam our check raise here or look us up. So I like this spot. And it's again, like talking about the things that I look for in a check raising situation. We've got a perceived wide opening range preflop, which is nice. So we have some kind of a player read. We have a blocker to hands that can fight back against us, which is nice. And 3, we have some pot equity if called, which is of course also nice. And where the profit in PLO really is made is by semi-bluffing and kind of turning 60%ers into bluffs, because they can be tricky to play, and I have no guarantee of realizing that 60% equity. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, this is another pretty standard check raising spot, I think, but I just want to run through it real quick. The cutoff opens 3x, call from the big blind, jack 10, 7, 8. Everything's pretty standard so far. There might be situations where I re-raise that pre-flop, but calling is certainly fine. Flop is queen 4, 5 rainbow. We check. Our opponent bets 455 into 650, basically 2/3. We check raise to 14. And he folds. Now, a couple of things that I really want to harp on, and I didn't just show you this one just to say it was awesome and go move on to the next one. No. First of all, I just want to say, and maybe I didn't mention this in the last hand, but if you're just calling to basically pair mine or draw mine or hand mine pre-flop any raise, you're going to lose uh, money in the long run. Most of the profitability from calling a raise pre-flop or playing really any hand pre-flop is from being able to win when you don't make a hand, especially in heads-up pots. In multi-way pots, where a lot of your profitability or your equity comes from is by, like making hands and getting paid, because the pots are bigger in multi-way pots. It's more often, coolers happen more often, so you've got all of that working for you. But I see a lot of players, I think, give up too much in heads up pots, and where I personally make most of my profit is playing heads up pots, because you're allowed to get more creative. Semi bluffing and value betting and bluffing are all thinner because you don't run into hands nearly as often. So in heads up pots, I'm constantly looking for ways to take it away. And I think that this is a good spot for it. We have a gut shot. We've got some decent barreling opportunities. We can backdoor straights. We can turn the gutter. We have a backdoor flush draw. And I just, although I don't have any blockers to the hands that can fight back against us, I think it's a board that he's c-betting pretty much every time, both with his good hands and with his complete air. This guy seems pretty aggressive overall. I think that number 51 there is the steal. Nope, that's fold to 3-bet. Steal's 45. Yep. 45 overall, and from the cutoff it could be, let's see here. This is a different computer, so. Well, 26 from the cutoff, but it's still pretty high enough for me. I think that's a spot where he would definitely steal, especially with this weaker player in the small. So, anyhow, long-winded way of saying, I think this is a good spot for a check raise, and these are the things that I look for. All right, so if you remember from the slides where we were talking about check raising lightly, I said, first was it's a good spot to check raise when you have a blocker, two hands that can fight back against you. But the second one was when you have blockers to hands that, or blockers to draws. So here we're going to talk about a situation like that. So button opens, looks like he's kind of aggressive, but not a big sample, so, take it with a grain of salt. We check, he bets 18-20, and we check raise. So again, this is another spot where Hold'em players would probably, or even consider check calling, because they say, hey, we have a gut shot. Our nines have pretty good showdown value against a wide C betting range, and I don't want to have to check raise fold because I have a draw and or whatever. So maybe I'll just call and he'll give up or something. Good players look for spots to be aggressive. Bad players usually look for spots to fold or check, as a general rule of thumb. I'm not saying to just go off, but I notice that when I'm playing better and I'm winning more and things are going better, that I'm playing pretty aggressive. And you do run to the nuts sometimes, or you get looked up sometimes, but in general, aggression wins in poker in one way or another. And I think this is a good spot to check raise because, hey, this guy seems aggressive so far. Again, he opened the button. People generally have very wide button opening ranges. And in case you didn't see that in that last hand when I pulled up that guy's HUD, I see a lot of players like that. They have they have 1,000 or 2,000 hand sample, and they're opening 28% from the cutoff, but they're opening 80% from the button. So when you know that although their steal can say 45, that's just because their button steal is so high. So make sure you're looking at people who have just wide ranges. So here I decided to check raise because I guess it's somewhat connected to the previous idea, but basically on this board when you do check raise, let's say we even had a set, or let's say we had Jack 8. Well, a lot of the hands that peel us are draws. He's going to peel us with the 9-10s, the 7-9-10s, the 9-10 queens, and we have 2 9s, so it's a lot less likely that he has a draw that can peel us. And what's better is, since we started the hand with 100 big blinds, or 100, I guess just under, the 9s serve as good blockers to when the draws fill. So if the turn's a 7, we can definitely barrel. If the turn's a 10, we can barrel. If the turn's a queen, I think we can profitably barrel and represent, 9-10 type hand. So most of the time when I'm check raising, I mean, although I would prefer to have the check raise work immediately on the flop, I try to do it in situations where I have some escape hatch if it doesn't work, and where a lot of money is made in PLO and Hold'em, I guess, as well, is setting your opponents up in situations where they put money into the pot and then give up on it. So here I thought that, like, even if I was called, I could barrel profitably and get him to fold and pick up the dead money that way. Okay, we've got our last hand here, but it reinforces the concepts that we talked about in the previous hand, but I thought it was good enough and a different board, so, good to talk about. So, button opens. It's looks like 50-cent dollar ante game. He opens 3x. We call from the small with 10, 10, 9, 5 double suited. There's some cases where I would 3-bet this. This guy seems pretty aggressive and competent, so I don't really want to re-raise a pot out of position against him. The big blind's not particularly aggressive, so I'm not, like, him squeezing me out of the pot or putting me in a tough situation isn't too much of a concern. So I think that peeling is fine. If you're sitting there watching this video and you're saying, oh man, I normally fold this, or like I normally take another option, it's probably fine. I think that in the right dynamics, 3-betting this is fine. In the right dynamics, folding it is fine even. I think in the right dynamics, like, calling it is fine. I personally chose to call here. The flop is 10, 6, 7 deuce. So we have a gutter, 2 backdoor flush draws, and an overpair. So again, like, talking about Hold'em players, a lot of people's like, damn, like, we have 10s, it's an overpair, it's like, we've got this wide button range who seems pretty aggressive, like, why don't we check raise? Or, I'm sorry, why don't we just check call? We're likely to have the best hand, don't want to, like, have to check raise, fold, etc., etc. Those are good arguments, but again, like, if the action stopped, that I would prefer check calling. But against someone this aggressive, the action's not going to stop. And so I chose to re-raise because, well, we have a lot of backdoor draws that'll allow us to barrel profitably. And I do think that our hand is best most of the time, so we're kind of like check raising for protection. But the thing is even if we have the best hand, there's no way he basically can't have like 30% equity. Overcards, like a Jack 10, 9, Queen type hand is like a gutter with some overcards. It's even difficult, if he does have, like, again, like, you have to plan for the times that you get called. If he re-raised me on the flop, I would obviously fold. But I think that for the most part, that's a lot of. I don't see too much like flop re-raising on these types of boards. A lot of the like re-raising wars happen on like paired boards and monotone boards, in more like polarized situations. So I re-raised here because I thought that with the 10 blockers, it's nice because I can barrel on all of the straightening runouts. So like if the turn's like 4, 5, 8, 9, stuff like that, I can, and I'm sure I could barrel like a 7 as well, even a 6. I'm sure I would fire. Backdoor, I have 2 backdoor flush draws. Like it's a good spot to like apply aggression and leverage my stack. He ends up folding, but I would have definitely barreled like any straight completing cards. And again, like, it's just easier to turn it into a bluff, really. Against a wide range. Again, like you can see, the main theme here is that I'm doing it against like a wide range. I'm not doing it against some nit. Like, this guy's already shown aggressive tendencies, and it's a board that I see that he's c-betting a lot on. So anyhow, all right, that's going to do it for today. Next time we are going to continue talking about check raising spots. I've got some more here lined up for you. Seems like the response to the videos has been really good so far. I'm proud of that, and I'm happy to help you guys, and I hope that you're winning more money because of the stuff that's in here. And if there's any questions you have, please comment in the forums or message me privately. Don't mind that as well. I love PLO. I love talking PLO with you guys, and I'm looking forward to doing more videos in the future. Appreciate it. Talk to you later. Good luck.